Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. So I just have a few housekeeping items to cover before we turn things over. Tonight the program goes until 7 p.m. So if you could exit out the back doors when it's time to leave. There's also 2 bathrooms in that hallway you can use at any point. On that back table over there, you'll see a few flyers for our other events that are in April. And there's an evaluation form over there. If you could fill it out at the end of the event, let us know what you thought. And if you have other programs you want to do in the future, let us know so we can plan those for you. Yeah. That's a good question. Not today, but I would love some. That's a good question. And that's all I had. So I'll turn things over to Andrew.
All right. Thank you so much. How's everyone doing this evening? I'm glad to hear it. I'm really excited. This is my first visit to Howell, but I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Andrew Kercher. My day job. I'm the Community Engagement Manager and Historian for Port Huron Museums. As I frequently like to tell people, you don't work in the museum field if you have a lust for money and power. So this is kind of my side hobby, hustle, side gig kind of things. I get to come around and speak at libraries all over Michigan. It's really fun. I enjoy it. I like getting to do that. So I'm really excited to be here tonight. And of course, I lived and worked up in Mackinac for close to a decade. So I still have a lot of very close friends who lived up there. It's a very special place to me that I called home for many years working for the state park. So it's a story that I really love to get to share. So I've found, having done this talk a number of times in different places, it's actually easier to ask, is there anyone here who has not been to Mackinac? So a few people. That's fine. This will be that's always exciting. That's actually usually the rarity in some of these talks. Most people have been. Some people go back many times. I've had people who are like, "Oh, I live there." It's like, well, you live here. Like, what do you need me to tell you about it for? But we've had a lot of different folks come here, and it's as many of you know who have been there. Hopefully, you've enjoyed your vacation or your trip or your stay. You know, it's a very special place. But we'll dive kind of right in. So this would actually be great if we still can grab those front couple of lights. Perfect. That'll be maybe a little bit easier to see. How's that? Solid. So as we can see here, this is, if you're not maybe familiar with the area, we got Mackinac up here. This is Mackinac City. So this is kind of the south end of the bridge. St. Ignace are the 2 major cities. And they got 3 islands in Lake Huron. There's Boblo Island, Round Island, Mackinac Island. Now, the whole area, I guess this would be a good place to start. It's always Mackinac. There's maybe one exception to that we'll talk about maybe at the very end, but it's always Mackinac. I know it's spelled funny. Mackinac City is spelled with the W because that was founded quite a bit later. And the post office was very confused between Mackinac City and Mackinac Island. That made it a lot easier for them, but it's always Mackinac. Everywhere but Mackinac City is spelled with the AC, and it's always pronounced Mackinac. So Mackinac Island, fudge, Mackinac Island, you name it. And that is the Straits of Mackinac. And as you can see, kind of geographically, it's a pretty rural area up there if you haven't been. Lots and lots of green on that map. You know, this isn't a big industrial area. In fact, you go just a little west of Mackinac City, and you wind up in a place literally called Wilderness State Park, which is pretty cool. Anybody here ever been to Wilderness before? Go out camping that way? It's pretty nice. There's a lot of nice trails out there. It's always a great place to go and visit. So really some interesting geography up there, of course, stuck between Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. And really, if you ask a geologist, those are the same lake. There's very few people who would consider this strait a river connecting 2 different lakes. And the water level is the same in Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. So the water level in Port Huron is actually exactly the same as it is over in Chicago. It's all one big body of water connected there at the straits. But culturally speaking, we talked, that's, you know, just a little geographically, but the really interesting stuff is, for me anyway, it's kind of the cultural history of Mackinac. Obviously, it's been inhabited for tens of thousands of years. The indigenous people are the Anishinaabes. The Anishinaabe are made up of the Odawa, the Ojibwa, the Potawatomi. There's a couple different names for some of these different groups that have lived there and passed through the area. Obviously, the water highway system that exists in the 18th, before basically the 19th century, that's how everyone gets around. So it's a very centrally located spot. And there's some actually great stories about Mackinac. The name itself, Michiganders, comes from basically land of the turtle or the great turtle. And the island does kind of look like a turtle. And there's actually a lot of really interesting stories. This is a snippet from one of those, The Legend of Mackinac Island. If you've ever gotten to read some of those legend books, I'm sure they have them here at the library. There's a couple of, I think, not Danish. I think he's a Dutch illustrator from maybe over the west side of the state. He's got a very long and hard to pronounce last name, but paints these beautiful paintings. Legend of Sleeping Bear Dunes, the Legend of Balloon, and the like. But the Legend of Mackinac Island, the story was always kind of that there was a flood that had flooded the whole world. All of the animals were floating around, clinging to different pieces of detritus, floating around. And they kind of all talked to each other and said, well, this is no good. We need something to grow again so we can eat. And the turtle said, well, if we could get some dirt, I can float here. We can put that dirt and we can grow something again. So everybody, that's going to be the goal. So a lot of the animals said they would dive down and see what they could find. So first it was the little otter who dove down as deep as he could. And he comes back up empty pawed, I guess. And he says, I couldn't find the bottom. It just seemed too deep for me. So then the beaver says, well, I'll try. I mean, I'm a stronger swimmer than the otter. And the beaver, with this great big tail, would swim down. He said, I got down so deep, it got really dark and I got scared. I had to turn around. I still couldn't find the bottom. Finally, it was the little tiny muskrat. Well, I'll try. And everyone kind of chuckled. Muskrat, what are you going to be? Well, the muskrat dives down. A couple minutes go by. They see a bunch of bubbles come back up. And then sadly, after another couple of minutes, they actually see the body of the muskrat float up. The muskrat had drowned in this attempt, but clutched in that little muskrat's paw was a handful of dirt. They were able to take that dirt, they put it right on the back of the turtle, and that's where all life sprang anew from, in that turtle, Mackinac Island. So a really interesting kind of story. It really shows the significance of the Straits of Mackinac and Mackinac Island and that whole region. If you've ever seen it up there and been boating, you can kind of see how it looks. A little bit like a turtle. But this is a great drawing of, I know, Dao man from the 18th century. But as I mentioned, they've lived there since time immemorial. Europeans really don't start coming through until into the 17th century. This is a great drawing. I really like the kind of colored tattoos the guy has all over him. It's really something that a lot of people noticed and commented on when Europeans arrived. They said everybody was covered in tattoos and Mackinac, lots of geometric designs. And a lot of the French, when they arrived here, that's the first thing they do. There was almost a rite of passage for a lot of voyageurs. If you made it to Mackinac, you got a tattoo to show off you made it there before you went back to the East Coast. Kind of a cool tradition. But you see it simply wearing, a breech clout like that. It's got a blanket and a bow and arrow there. There's another drawing. Obviously, we don't have any photographs from that time period. This is a drawing from the 1760s from a British visitor to the area. And I just really like this family because he got dad and he's got his hunting gun and powder horn. Mom carrying a kid on her back. She's got a heavy blanket on. And I really like Junior here, who A, is shaved bald, and B, is smoking a cool pipe. So Junior looks like the kind of guy I'd want to be friends with. He's pretty cool there. And just a little tiny sketch and like a margin from somebody who was there. There's a little bit of a better painting that actually shows you just how much would change after European contact in the area in just a couple hundred years. These are two Odawa men on Mackinac Island about 1810 or so, right before the War of 1812. And they are decked out with a lot of European imports, a lot of European clothing. In fact, the guy there in the blue jacket, he's holding a top hat. Like, that's pretty cool. He's got a top hat, but a lot of it is adorned with some, indigenous beadwork, things like that. So there was really a cultural melting pot up in Mackinac between primarily the French and the indigenous people of the Anishinaabe. And it was the French who were the first to come through that area all the way back in 1615. So that is 5 years before the Pilgrims would land at Plymouth Rock. We've got Jean Nicolet is paddling through. So the French had established outposts on the East Coast, places like Montreal, Quebec, all the way back into the late 16th century, so the 1500s. And they were always kind of exploring inland. And the goal, just like Columbus, what he was looking for was a shortcut to the Pacific Ocean. The French thought they may have found one. They found these waterways. They realized that obviously North America is a pretty big landmass, but they thought there might have been a way to navigate through on water most of the way. And so Jean Nicolet heads out in 1615 onto the Great Lakes, looking further and further west. And he is looking actually for China. He brought with him a silk robe that he was going to wear when he could finally make an appearance in the Chinese emperor's court. And he had brought, tokens of esteem from the French king. And he gets all the way to Green Bay, Wisconsin. So he is just a little lost, doesn't make it quite to China. But he does meet a lot of Fox in Miami out in Wisconsin. He fires his guns in the air. He's the first white person anyone's ever seen in those parts. And everybody runs and hides for a day because this guy looks like a lunatic, shooting a gun in the air. But he finds the people actually be very friendly, very agreeable to his presence, to trade. And the thing that he finds is probably more important than that shortcut to China that doesn't really exist. Is he found this, a lot of fur-bearing animals throughout the Great Lakes. Now, fur-bearing animals were so important economically to Michigan, it's really hard to overstate. And it's because a lot of people were wearing clothing and accessories that involve fur. And that seems like such a weird thing to base your entire economy around. I always kind of joke that it would be like, oh, yeah, if the state of Michigan today, our economy was based on like skinny jeans or something like that. It's kind of, a fad, a popular fashion item. But it really, for hundreds of years, the fur felt hat was not only just a fashion item, it was basically required as an element, just like you wouldn't go outside without pants on today. You wouldn't go outside without your hat. And the fur felt hat is not a hat. Like a lot of people, when they think about a fur hat, they're thinking like Davy Crockett, right? So if you hear a beaver hat, you think, oh, it'll be a furry hat and have a big floppy tail on the back, it's a little raccoon tail. But we're not Daniel Boone, not Davy Crockett. It's not anything Fess Parker would wear. But it's hats that are a fur felt. So animals like the beaver especially have these long guard hairs. They have an incredibly dense fur that is waterproof. So what you can do, in fact, that fur, most of those, you can kind of even see some of those longer hairs are called guard hairs. And Europeans found out very early on that there had been beaver in Europe, but they had been trapped nearly to extinction. So that's one of the reasons Nicolay is so excited about that. So if you can remove those long guard hairs, which prior to about the 1730s was done basically by wearing one of these beaver. A lot of indigenous people, they trap a beaver and turn it into like a cloak, wear the furry side on the inside, and just the friction from wearing one for a couple of weeks would wear off most of those guard hairs. You take those long hairs and you rub them together. You can do this with even like pet hair. If anybody got a dog or a cat at home, you take a bunch of that hair that everybody inevitably lines up all over your couch. You rub it together and it will stick. It will become like a felt. And that's what they would do to this felting process. Later on, they would invent a process where they would, by the time they're not making tricorn hats like this anymore, they're making fancier hats. They would invent a chemical process called kerating, turned everything orange, to strip those long hairs. And it was a waterproof, incredibly durable material. It was very, very valuable. The only beaver still left in Europe were in the far norths of Russia. The Tsar didn't want to trade very much. So it's not so much that the fur was important, but the money you could make from selling them. All about money and how much could be made in this area. And to give you an idea of that, this guy right here, this is John Jacob Astor. Probably a name that many of you have heard before. I like that coin on the right, makes him look particularly Roman, I suppose, and that's from the American Fur Company that he would found. How many of you ever heard the name John Jacob Astor before? Now, most of us, I think when we hear about John Jacob Astor, we think about this John Jacob Astor. And what is he famous for? He went down on the Titanic. Yeah, so we're just past the anniversary of the Titanic sinking just yesterday. And so John Jacob Astor the fourth was actually the richest passenger on the Titanic. And that tells you everything you need to know about the economics of the fur trade. Is if John Jacob Astor, your great-great-grandfather, the first, made so much money that you, John Jacob Astor the fourth, are still incredibly rich, the richest person on the Titanic, a ship known for being full of people like, the Strausses and other millionaires, you still have all that money. That shows you just how much money was in that fur trade. It created generational wealth for people who were able to play their cards right. So a lot of money on the table. That is, again, why Nicolay was so excited to see them. This is a great map. I really love this particular map. This is a map from 1755. It's a little confusing because there's an insert at the top that actually shows a close-up of Louisiana. But this shows all of North America. And the interesting thing is it doesn't have the modern political boundaries that we're used to. We're used to seeing the state lines in Canada and things like that. Yeah, you see some colors where you see, this is Spanish Florida. the 13 colonies. This huge chunk here is all belongs to France. But the interesting thing is these rivers that are mapped on, because that's how everyone gets around in the 18th century. And as a result, if you can get on a river just about anywhere in North America, so the French are coming into places like Quebec, Montreal, right over here. They can head from Montreal over the French and Ottawa rivers, the Ottawa River into Lake Huron, and then boom, you're right there up to the Straits. That's about 1,000 miles. You could do that canoe trip in about 30 days, which is comparatively pretty fast. And it's not what we're used to today, but 30 days that far inland here to Michigan from the East Coast, that's pretty quick. And all of these rivers, if you can get on any of them, you'll notice so many of them lead back to the Great Lakes. And you'll notice Mackinac is right there in the middle of the continent. So it is truly a crossroads for all of North America. And it would see headquarters for a number of things. For example, Father Marquette, a lot of the French missionary abbats. The French are, of course, very Catholic. And so they send a lot of missionaries, a lot of Jesuits in the area. They are going on these kind of exploratory and mapping missions, mapping out the people and places of North America. And at one point, they knew the Mississippi in New Orleans. It was this huge river, huge outlet, but nobody knew where the headwaters of the Mississippi were. And so it was actually Marquette who left with Joliet, another name that's maybe kind of familiar. And they left in the 1670s from Mackinac, from St. Ignace, where they were able to find in Wisconsin a river that was definitely the Mississippi. They took it all the way down, as you can see, into Arkansas. And that was the point where they said, all right, we have concluded for sure this is the same Mississippi River. They didn't want to go all the way to New Orleans, which was controlled by the Spanish at the time. And the French and Spanish weren't getting along in the 1670s. So they said, if we show up in New Orleans, they are going to arrest us. So instead, we're just going to turn around. But so noted for the maps and that entire trip. Now, it doesn't go great for Father Marquette because he dies, but his remains are actually brought back to St. Ignace. So if you've ever been up that way, the French, when they established some of their missions around Mackinac, the very first kind of permanent mission is in that 1670s. There is a small mission in St. Ignace. They're actually on Mackinac Island for only about 1 year. They find it really inconvenient to be on the island. It's kind of hard to get on and off, and it's really hard to grow any food there. So they form a place called Fort de Bois in St. Ignace. This was actually the French had left Port Huron. They were down there for a couple of years in the 1680s. They're all over Michigan. One of the things that's very confusing is the French love to name all of their forts Fort St. Joseph. So there's about 4 of them in Michigan alone. So that's always a little tricky, but they do wind up, Mackinac is kind of their place to be by the turn of the 18th century, 1700s. There's even a brief period where the fur trade itself is completely abandoned. There's a glut of furs on the market in like the 1690s. There's too many. The King of France says, stop trading furs. We need the prices to go up on them. And they actually had to burn piles of furs and things like that. But by 1715, the fur trade is, they're interested in getting it going again. And this is what they would establish. By 1715, when the French come back and force to stay, they build Michiganders. So this is in modern day Mackinac City. And all of these are within kind of 5 miles of each other on the Straits. They decided it was a lot easier to build on the mainland for a number of reasons. As I mentioned, growing food's really kind of difficult to do at scale on Mackinac Island. Mackinac Island had a lot of spiritual significance to the indigenous people. So a lot of them said like, hey, we don't necessarily want you building, setting up your housing permanently there. It'd be like somebody like camping at the Vatican or something like that. They're like, yeah, could you find somewhere else to go? And one of the other big things that's easy for us to forget is think about the amount of firewood one might consume in a year. Not even just for cooking, but for heat, for cleaning. Even in the summer when you do want hot food, you got to have a fire basically every single day. That is an enormous amount of firewood. And in fact, by the 1780s, trees had been clear cut about 10 miles in every direction of the Straits of Mackinac, just for the need of firewood. So this is what they had. Now, we call this Fort Michilimackinac, which of course would later be shortened just to Mackinac. And we call it a fort, but this was really more of a fortified fur trading village. So it's a village, it's got a wall around it that would keep away any kind of small scale raid, not like a concerted European attack or anything like that. And there were a couple of soldiers. Most of the time at a place like this, there might be 20 soldiers. It's not a huge burgeoning fort like we think of maybe back in Europe or even like a castle or anything like that. A couple cannons, few soldiers, keep an eye on things. And they're really making sure everybody's paying their taxes. They act a little bit more like police. By the 1750s, Michilimackinac had grown pretty significantly, again, to the point where they might have well over 1,000 people there in the summertime coming to this area to engage in this fur trade. As trade goods make their way from the East Coast, from Montreal, 30 days by canoe to Michilimackinac, and furs are coming in from the west and from all over, anywhere they can trap them. Everybody meets up in the summer to exchange the goods. It's like a great big truck stop. One of the things that's really cool, this drawing is based on a map right up here that was drawn by a French military engineer named Lopinière, who apparently did not have access to a right angle. So pretty good, I mean, but not exactly square there. But he's even went far enough to write individual fur traders' names on some of the homes, so we know who owned some of the homes there at Michilimackinac. Pretty cool. Now, France in the 1750s. This is a great map. This really shows some political control in North America, and it can be a little bit misleading when you see something like this on a map, because we see this huge swath of territory that the French are laying claim to there in blue, and the comparatively very small little 13 colonies, right? But the thing this map does not tell you is that in the 13 colony, well, I'll tell you, in all of New France, that entire territory, Louisiana, Michigan, all the way up to the maritime provinces in Canada, there were between 75 to 100,000 Frenchmen. That's about how many French were living there. A lot of Frenchmen would show up in North America. They would make a lot of money, and then they'd go back to France. They weren't really interested in sticking around until they had made their money. But you look at the 13 colonies there, and there were about 3 million British settlers who are living there. And so there's just like an order of magnitude more of these British colonists have moved into the area. Not to mention that, this doesn't show any of the control or the millions of indigenous people who are still living here at the time. Now, it kind of makes sense that Great Britain and France have long been enemies at this time, and that their two colonial empires bump into each other, that there's going to be conflict. Now, I am a historian. It is my job professionally to tell people about the past, but sometimes you run into historical mysteries, and this might be one of them, because ultimately France and England, and the spark that would set off this powder keg is right here. These two countries would be fighting over Ohio. Why anyone would want to do that is just beyond me. But Ohio is the territory where war would break out. In fact, there was, if you look again at this map, there's a place in Ohio. If you've ever been down 75 and you're driving through Ohio, you've probably seen a sign or exits for Piqua, Ohio, P-I-Q-A. And that's modern day Piqua. In the 18th century, there was a place called Pickawillany. It was a small village. Pickawillany had a number of Miami who were living there. And they had begun trading with the British. And the French governor in Quebec hears this, and he's pretty mad. So what he does is he sends a letter to the garrison at Detroit and says, send some soldiers down and remind them they have a trade agreement with us. They're not supposed to trade with them. And the leader at Detroit has a really interesting tactic that I wish still worked. It really only works in the 18th century. He got the letter and just pretended he didn't. And just said like, oh, what letter? I don't know, must have got lost. That happens all the time. How many actually got lost? Maybe another question. So the guy at Quebec sends another letter to the guy up in Mackinac, the commandant. So send some soldiers down. The commandant's like, I really can't afford any extra men. We have a small garrison up here. I don't know. But eventually word filters down to one of the coolest Frenchmen to have ever been born at Michilimackinac. One of the coolest just people in general, because he's actually Métis. So he's half French, he's half indigenous. His father is French. His mother was a prominent member of Ottawa society. So he spoke both Algonquin and French fluently, and he could really serve as kind of a bridge between worlds. His name's Charles Langlade. Charles Langlade gets this letter, and to give me the kind of idea of what the kind of guy Charles Langlade was, on his deathbed, Charles Langlade said he had but one regret. And his regret was that he had fought in 99 battles, that he didn't make it in even 100. So, cool guy. So Langlade gets this letter and says, hey, when do we go? I want to go teach some Miami a lesson. And so can you imagine going all the way from Michilimackinac all the way down close to the Ohio River in southern Ohio? That's a long trip today by car. They're doing it by canoe and walking. And so when they get down there, they basically burn down the village. Lesson learned, right? and Charles L'Anglois goes home. Well, then the British send a retaliatory raid into Ohio, led by a guy named Edwin Braddock and a young Virginian, kind of a brash young guy who really doesn't know what he's doing, named George Washington. He's only 21 years old. They bumble into the woods, they get ambushed, they get a lot of their men killed, and they spark off a world war. This war in North America would be called the French and Indian War. Back in Europe, this is part of the 7 Years' War between, again, a couple of competing alliances in Europe. This truly was, in some ways, the first world war because you have fighting all over the whole world. Because when France and England go to war against each other, their colonies go to war. So that means there was fighting in places like India, places like the Caribbean, places like North America. This was truly a global conflict. Doesn't go very well for Britain at first. They actually do pretty poorly. The French are doing great until we get to 1759. Now, the next dinner party you're at, if you want to sound really pretentious, you can find a way to bring this up. You talk about 1759. Oh, yes, historians call that Britain's Annus Mirabilis, the year of miracles in Latin, because there were a series of these huge victories for Great Britain that were really kind of unexpected, all right in a row. One of the big ones was at Quebec. And this is really what would have a lot of implications for Michigan and Mackinac. So this is a huge battle in Quebec. Quebec is one of the only walled cities in North America. They're like a medieval city with a wall. And the British found this little goat path so they could get the army kind of behind the city. They forced the French to come out and fight. And the two sides line up. This is linear warfare. They each fire their muskets at each other. And this is a battle that was over in about 15 minutes. The British just had a couple of really great volleys that found their mark. The French general was mortally wounded. A lot of the French were killed. Enough of them threw down their arms, and the British were able to take over Quebec. Sadly, this painting is called The Death of Wolfe. The British commander at the time, who you could probably guess which one he is one kind of dramatically dying there in the middle. Anybody ever seen this painting in person? There are a few of them. There's one at U of M. At the art museum on campus. This is much smaller than real scale, even projected here. This painting is much larger than life. It's a great painting if you ever get a chance to see it. But Wolfe is, also mortally wounded. But in that 15 minutes, the French were forced to give up their claim on North America. That is when you go from French Canada to British Canada. And of course, that means Michigan as well would fall under the British flag. The British would arrive at Michilimackinac by winning this battle 1,000 miles away. Interestingly enough, the very first English-speaking person to show up in the area would be this guy, Robert Rogers. Robert Rogers had a military unit called Rogers Rangers. Ever heard of the U.S. Army Rangers? They take their name from Robert Rogers Rangers. They were kind of like special forces. This is kind of an aside, but did anybody here watch AMC's show Turn about George Washington's spies? So Robert Rogers is in that show. He has like an outrageous Scottish brogue, if you remember that character. It's very funny. He was born in Connecticut. So I don't know, maybe it was a creative decision that they made for AMC. He was not from Scotland. But Robert Rogers, kind of a neat guy. So Robert Rogers arrives on the scene in 1761 to see, this is what Michilimackinac looked like. So here's an English map of the fort. This is still in Mackinac City. Again, the entire area has been clear cut outside. There are some farm fields. There are great big sand dunes that you can see up here outside the fort. They'd even built like a little dock. They would even send, in the late 1760s, Robert Rogers on a trip to try and find that Northwest Passage that everybody's been looking for. They made that into a great movie called Northwest Passage, if you've ever seen that one. All about Robert Rogers, and his expedition leads to Michilimackinac. This was, when the British take over, the westernmost point in the entire British Empire. This was as far flung as it got. And again, this is what it looked like. Now, they did have one problem. When they arrived, the British really tended to treat the area as a conquered people. However, the Odawa and Ojibwa, the Anishinaabe from Michigan said, hold on, hold the phone. You never beat us in battle. This was a territorial agreement because of a battle in Quebec 1,000 miles away that we had nothing to do with. So they were not particularly happy with the British. So there was an indigenous leader, a guy by the name of Pontiac. He had a brother named Nowlin, which was translated as the prophet. And they went around. They started talking to native groups all over the Great Lakes. And they said, hey, we all work together. We can drive the British out. There's not very many of them. If we could take these British forts, we could invite the French back. Things will be good again. Maybe we can even set up our own country. We won't have to deal with the British and the British king. And so there was a plan by 1763 in the spring to attack these British posts. And a number of them, it was comically simple to do. There are places like Fort Wyandotte or Fort Miami in Ohio, which is a post that only has maybe a dozen British soldiers. And some local natives showed up and they said, hey, we want to talk to your lieutenant inside who's in charge. You come outside, we want to talk to you. Lieutenant went outside. Well, they just grabbed him. And that was it. They took the fort. That was easy. There were two nuts that were going to be tougher to crack than the rest: Detroit and Michiganders. Now, Pontiac makes his way down to Fort Detroit, and ultimately they would fail to take the fort by ruse. They would lay siege to Detroit throughout the entire summer of 1763. And you have things like the Battle of Bloody Run, Bushy Lane, things like that that are part of this battle. Spoiler alert, they don't win. Detroit's able to hold out in the siege. But at Michilimackinac, this is probably one of the greatest military victories. Certainly, this is the greatest battle in Michigan military history. One of the coolest ruses, because up there, there's a guy named Wadham, who's an indigenous leader who's trying to help out Pontiac. And their plan is they talk to the British commandant at the time. There's a man up there, a captain by the name of George Etherington. And think about every stereotype of a British military officer that you can conjure up from any kind of movie. That's kind of what George Etherington is. He is incredibly arrogant, he's prideful, he thinks he's better than everyone else, he's kind of aristocratic, and he's also a bit of a buffoon. He has his position by merit of being a rich guy rather than any kind of merit. So he has a garrison up there, about 35 soldiers. They've got cannons, they've got walls. That'd be a pretty tough place to attack if you didn't have any cannons. So what their plan is, they actually approach Etherington and they just feign that they love the king. They're like, yeah, this is so great you're here. In fact, the king's birthday on June the 4th. This is like the 4th of July. They have the 4th of June. So it's the king's birthday. We want to honor the king. We just love him so much. We want to play a game of Bagadaway. Anybody know what we call Bagadaway today? Lacrosse. All right, so this would be an exciting thing. Bagadaway is what modern day lacrosse is. This is actually an indigenous sport we still play today. Lacrosse was kind of the Haudenosaunee name for it in upstate New York. This is the Anishinaabe name. So they said, we want to play this game, Bagadaway. And Bagadaway is, unlike lacrosse, can have hundreds of players and fields that can be miles long. There are no rules. Bagadaway literally translates to the little brother of war. I mean, you're going to see some broken bones and bruises. So you get 600 warriors who show up, who are all there to play in honor of the king's birthday. What does Etherington do? Even though he is now outnumbered like 20-1, instead of buttoning up the fort or being cautious, he says, oh, all the soldiers can have the day off. It's the king's birthday. And not only does he go out to watch the game, he throws the opening ball into play, places a large bet on the home team. Within a matter of minutes, no one seemed to notice that even though it was a hot June day, native women wearing heavy wool blankets lined the walls of the fort. They had concealed all sorts of weapons. And when the ball is basically knocked right at the foot of George Etherington, he looks down to see that, and they run over, they grab him. They grab his kind of second in command. There's a Lieutenant Jamais, who's the only man to put up any kind of resistance, because at that point, the women drop the blankets and out comes knives, tomahawks, guns. Lieutenant Jamais is seen sword fighting like 8 people at once, and he just completely outnumbered. And so the native people were able to take Michilimackinac in a pretty cool victory. But ultimately, they're not able to win the war. It's a case of win the battle, but not the war. One of their grievances was addressed by the British king. The British king said, yeah, that's right. There are too many of these colonists moving onto your land. So he ultimately, in 1763, would draw a line down the Appalachian Mountains. This was called the Proclamation of 1763. Basically told all the colonists, stop moving west. That is Indian Reserve. You're not allowed out there. And what do the colonists do? They immediately move west. They completely ignore that and say, oh, there's all that great farmland out there. And in fact, that proclamation line is going to be one of the grievances that would wind up the Declaration of Independence not too much longer. There's a growing resentment on the British government taxes, more than we have time to get into here, but here's some rebel propaganda for you of the Boston Massacre, where no, they don't ever show you the Boston mob throwing like rocks and ice balls at the soldiers. These soldiers were actually acquitted of any wrongdoing in a colonial court. But we now have the Declaration of Independence and, of course, the Revolutionary War. So how does that impact Michilimackinac? I love this map because it shows you when we think about the American Revolution, we think about things like um, the Battle of Bunker Hill or Yorktown. Those are all on the East Coast. These are all the battles. Here in Michigan, this is a pretty blank part of the map, although you can see this really long Michilimackinac name sticking out from Mackinac City there. There were a few military actions. Michilimackinac would go to reinforce places like Quebec and Montreal when the Americans invaded Canada in 1775. They invaded Canada and said, they'll greet us as liberators. That did not happen. It's not the last time that would be said in American history. It fails, and Michilimackinac is reinforcements for the East Coast. Later on, by 1780s, when Spain is involved in the war, soldiers are sent from Michilimackinac all the way down to Detroit, and then from Detroit all the way down to St. Louis. If you can imagine walking and canoeing from Michilimackinac to St. Louis, Missouri, that's quite a trip. And let alone when you get there, there are people who want to kill you. So they fail in that attack, but they are involved in the war. They are concerned, however. The man on the left there, that's a painting of Arndt Schuyler de Peister, who was the commandant at Michilimackinac for many years in the 8th Regiment of Foot. He actually does such a good job mustering reinforcements that he is promoted to be major, and he is sent over to take over the fort at Detroit. And the guy on the right there, Patrick Sinclair, that's actually the only image we have of him. I know he looks like a video game character you haven't unlocked yet, but that silhouette, that's it. Patrick Sinclair takes over at Michilimackinac. The first thing he does when he gets there is he says, this fort is undefensible. We're right on the water. We have wooden walls. If the rebels come up here with a cannon on a gunboat, they will batter this fort down from the water. And so he says, we got to move. And he immediately begins a move to Mackinac Island. This is a much more defensible position. Now he has a problem, because as I mentioned before, this is a fortified fur trading village. It's not so much just a military fort. There's mostly civilians there. How do you make the civilians move with you? Well, the very first building they move was the church. So this is St. Anne's. This is the reconstruction of the original St. Anne's from the 1750s on its original location. It was moved to Mackinac Island. And many of us, how many of you have been to St. Anne's on the island today? This is kind of like, it's kind of the same St. Anne's. It's one of those, it's like George Washington's axe. They've only replaced the head twice and the handle 3 times. Is it the same building? Yes, no, maybe somewhere in between. It saw a major reconstruction in the 1880s. So it looks quite a bit different, but it is the same parish, the same church, shares that same lineage. And so a lot of the row houses like this, these were the private homes, were moved over. One of those homes that was moved was actually the priest's house from Michilimackinac. And there's a really good guess. This is a house that's now, many of you probably have been in the McGulpin house. It's right at kind of the foot of the hill where you head up into the fort. Anybody ever been into this house before? It actually matches, it's the exact same size as the priest's house was found archaeologically at Michilimackinac. And we can't prove it for certain. We know that the wood in this building, none of it was sawn at a sawmill that was established in 1780, so it's likely older than that. And if we could prove that was the priest's house, that would make this actually the oldest building in the state of Michigan. Pretty cool. It's moved a number of times, but it would date all the way back to like the 1740s. They moved things like the barracks. They would even try to move the powder magazine. The problem is the powder magazine. This was a powder magazine that held 50,000 pounds of gunpowder, and it was semi-subterranean, which means it was half buried in the ground. Kind of hard to move a hole in the ground. Here you can see it was kind of in the corner of the fort, had a little fence, dirt mound up on top. So what they did was they took out all the gunpowder and they burned what was left of the building because they didn't want to leave anything behind in case people like George Rogers Clark and the American rebels were to come up to Michilimackinac. And so that's actually the largest original remains of the original fort. And they, of course, built Fort Mackinac. So these are now some of the oldest buildings in the state of Michigan, 1780, built during the American Revolution. And this is a very defensible fort. How many of you, when you went to Mackinac Island, visited Fort Mackinac? How many of you found it a bit of a challenge to climb all of that hill without being winded at the top? And no one, I assure you, was trying to kill you when you on the inside. So if they wanted you, and this is, they want you to come in. If they didn't want you to come in, this would be a very defensible location. They would also build blockhouses. And here you can see the fort from the air. So you can see the heavy limestone walls here. This faces Haldeman Bay, which would be like down there. It's where everyone comes into. Back here, this was more just like a big picket fence. There were still some of those block houses. Some of the one of my favorite things that you can see in this picture is behind the fort. There's actually a baseball field back here. I don't know if anyone's ever seen one of the baseball games that play up here. That is actually the longest continuously used baseball field in the Midwest, because it goes all the way back to the 1860s. They were using that at the fort, which is kind of cool. The other neat thing is there's the scout barracks all the way up there. One of those things everybody knows about Mackinac Island. There's always Boy Scouts up there. That scout barracks has been there since the 1920s. Now, the really interesting thing is that was an Eagle Scout project of one very specific Eagle Scout. Anybody know who? Gerald Ford. So I always kind of laugh. I love Eagle Scouts. I was a scout myself. I didn't make Eagle, but you know, sometimes we have Eagle Scouts. Oh, I'll build a picnic table for my Eagle Scout project. Gerald Ford built that barracks they're using 100 years later. That's an Eagle Scout project. So, but they'd spend all this time building this huge fort, and the war would end. So the Americans, of course, win. They sign a treaty called the Treaty of Paris. This is a painting of the Treaty of Paris. This is the American delegation. You probably recognize at least this guy, right? The British delegation refused to sit for the painting. So as soon as they had signed, they're like, bye, see ya. And it's just unfinished there. Eventually, John Jay would further negotiate and refine exactly where the new territorial boundaries would be. But that's when Mackinac comes into the possession of the new United States. And this is what it would look like. This is one of these drawings of it. Still functioning as a fur trading village, now under American jurisdiction. You can see the island looks particularly bald in these pictures. As I mentioned, they had clear cut the island for firewood. That's probably one of the biggest differences. If you were to get into a time machine and go back a couple hundred years, like, hey, where's all the trees? They're gone. There are a few trees on the island that are, you know, a couple hundred years old that didn't get cut down, but the vast majority of them were clear cuts. Most of the trees you see today have been planted in the last couple. So Mackinac would continue to function as that fur trade post until the War of 1812. When we think about the War of 1812, a lot of people think about the Battle of New Orleans, and that's about it. It's kind of a footnote in American history in many ways. The Americans would not do well in the war, especially in Michigan. This is the surrender at Detroit, where Detroit would surrender almost immediately. But even beforehand, Michiganders was the site of the very first land action of the War of 1812. During that war, the United States declares war on Britain. Both Great Britain and the United States send runners to all of their forts to let them know, okay, state of war exists. The British runner got to Canada much faster. And so a British force of about 600 men would land at very conveniently named British Landing here on the back of the island. They would come over the island up right here to the high point of the island. Now, as high up as Fort Mackinac is over Haldeman Bay, this spot is even higher comparatively over Fort Mackinac. And when they would arrive up there, this is where it is today, give you an idea of that viewpoint, they would say, you got to surrender the fort or we're going to shell you and the town and kill everybody. Porter Hanks, the lieutenant in charge, did not know the countries were even at war until that morning, and the British soldiers had already landed. He was forced to surrender. He really had no choice. He went down to Detroit. He was paroled. When he gets down to Detroit, he says, you know, I want a court martial because I want to be able to go on the record and say, no one even told me we were at war. How was I supposed to defend the island? It was too late. I was surrounded and outnumbered, and they had the high ground. And while he's at Detroit, this is less than a week after he surrendered Fort Mackinac, the British attack Fort Detroit, and the second cannonball they fire at Fort Detroit smashes through the room where Porter Hanks is staying and removes his head. So your week can always get worse. So poor Porter Hanks. But the British would actually then build a blockhouse up on that high point on the island. They weren't going to have that same mistake happen to them. They called it Fort George. Now, by 1814, there is actually a pitched battle on Mackinac Island. The Americans come back. They want to take Fort Mackinac. There's a guy named Major Andrew Hunter Holmes who is interested in becoming president one day. And he knows to become president, you got to win a big battle. And so even though there's not a lot of strategic value in taking Mackinac Island, because by that point, after the Battle of Lake Erie, the American Navy controlled the Great Lakes, and Mackinac Island is famously an island. So the British are stuck there. But he wanted to go and fight them and take over the island. The battle is very inconclusive. The American ships would show up. They would even shell the back of the island for hours. It's kind of funny if you read some of their records. The brig Niagara and the brig Lawrence would say that they killed hundreds of Indians on shore with their bombardment. Not a single British soldier or any of their native allies were even hurt during this battle. That's zero casualties on their side. There was no one down there. They were just shooting at an empty beach and blowing up a bunch of trees. But the Americans would fight until Andrew Hunter Holmes, the commander, was killed. He was shot in the head. And then immediately his second in command, who did not want to be there, looked around at all the other officers and said, "Can we leave now? He's dead?" And they said, "Sure." So everybody just turns around and leaves. So it is an American loss, but the British don't really gain anything by it. This is actually a battle that we would reenact on the 200th anniversary. We reenacted it at about 1/10 scale, actually, on the same location. That's me in the sergeant's uniform right there with the American forces. Here's some of our terrifying enemy, the British. What makes this not particularly scary is today that battlefield, it's actually in the middle of a golf course. So this is Wawashkamo Golf Course. The British did not have access to golf carts 200 years ago. But the British do pretty well in the war. They even burned down the capital. So it's amazing when, by 1815, they signed the Treaty of Ghent, and the war ends. It goes to a status quo antebellum. So the Americans regain Mackinac diplomatically, which they couldn't do militarily. Now, the fur trade is continuing. It is starting to dwindle a little bit by the 1820s. There are still things like the American Fur Company store headquarters had been built. This is John Jacob Astor's headquarters. It was the site of a really interesting incident in the 1820s, about 200 years ago. This is Alexis St. Martin. He was a voyageur, one of these canoe paddlers, who there was an accident in this fur company store. And they run in, they get the doctor. His name's Dr. William Beaumont, which is probably a familiar name to Michiganders. Dr. William Beaumont comes running. He comes inside the store, and the first thing all the voyageurs say is, "It was an accident. None of us have been drinking." Which he says, "Okay, what happened?" They said a gun went off that shot Alexis St. Martin. He had been shot right up here in the stomach. And William Beaumont looks at him and is like, "Hey, man, it's the 1820s. We don't know what germs are yet. This isn't going to be good for you." But fortunately, there's this medical miracle. He survives, and actually the wound heals with an open hole. And Beaumont puts basically like a little skin flap over this hole, so he has access to the stomach. So this is how they actually discover how digestion works, which is pretty amazing. So Dr. William Beaumont discovered digestion. That's why they named hospitals after him. Every year, us Islanders would celebrate Alexis St. Martin Day. The anniversary was always a couple days before the 4th. It was the 6th of June is when that happened. So every year we'd have a big party, but the rule for the party was all the food had to come on a string, because Dr. William Beaumont would put little chunks of cheese or chicken, they put it inside the little flap on a string, and that's how we figured out how digestion works. So that's what we do with our party. That was the rule. Here's the very first photograph of Mackinac Island in the 1840s. Now, as the fur trade would wane, you can see again the fort and the conspicuous lack of trees. As the fur trade would wane, commercial fishing would replace that in the 1850s and 1860s. By the time of the American Civil War, believe it or not, Mackinac Island was actually a prison. So these three Tennesseans who were loyal to the Confederacy were imprisoned on Mackinac Island in 1862 because they didn't know where else to stick them. They were civilians, but they were still helping the rebels. And so Mackinac Island was a really convenient island jail for them. So they actually sent up guards. This is called the Stanton Guard. I actually do a whole talk just on the Stanton Guards, kind of a neat story. So it did see some service during the Civil War as well. By the time the Civil War is done, soldiers would return. Even by this point, though, this was not a militarily significant outpost. They weren't scared of Canada invading or anything like that. Here you can see some of the soldiers firing on Rifle Range Trail. Actually, some of the soldiers on Mackinac Island were some of the best shots in the entire United States Army. They had a lot of really nice rifle ranges, a lot of time to practice their marksmanship. In 1872, Mackinac Island would actually become a national park. A lot of people don't realize that that was our second national park after Yellowstone. And it would be a national park until 1895. The soldiers essentially served as the park guides. People knew that Mackinac Island had all these beautiful features, things like Arch Rock. That was beautiful in the 1870s, just like it is today. They had also begun to build some tourist amenities, things like Grand Hotel, which is actually built by a railroad company, so they could sell you tickets to go visit their hotel on their train. They get money coming and going. There's a modern picture of the hotel that is right when it opened, really not too different. So it's one of the coolest old hotels. As I mentioned, that baseball field was in use by teams. Like, this is a picture of one of the men who was part of the Fort Mackinac Never Sweats, which is one of my favorite baseball team names, who played teams all around the Great Lakes. And so you see pictures like this of tourists coming up and visiting the island. You see pictures like this. Aside from the big barn that was used by the Army in Marquette Park, this picture, you could do a pretty good job of replicating that today. And they built large numbers of trails throughout the island for people to enjoy. People like Captain George Brady, I just love his facial hair, had to include him. He's the commandant there for some of the middle of the 1880s. And again, these soldiers are serving effectively as park guides. Also at that time, the federal government owns about 80% of the island. About 20% of the island is privately owned. That's when you start to see the building of these cottages. This cottage, I think this might be the one that is actually currently for sale. I'm surprised it's going pretty cheap. It's about $9 million. So we could all pool our funds if we're interested in buy one of these cottages that are built on the East Bluff and the West Bluff. There are some pretty amazing homes. Now, Mackinac Island is probably perhaps most famous today for one thing in particular. And what's that? No cars. Yeah, so in 1898, they banned automobiles. And a lot of small communities did in the 1890s. The problem is, on a community that's not on an island, eventually cars were going to come to town and people would have a hard time keeping them out. And people just kind of saw the advantages to it. On an island, a literal island, the ban just kind of stuck. And long enough that that became their kind of shtick, their gimmick that would continue to attract people when they were tourist-based, not having the cars. So, as I mentioned, the island is about 80% owned by in 1895, the national park closed. They closed the fort. They realized there was no military necessity for it anymore. And so they were going to actually just close the national park because there was no national park service. There were no rangers. Without the soldiers there was no representative from the federal government. That's when the state said, hold on, we take it over. And so Michigan State took it over as the first state park, and actually one of the first state parks anywhere in the country, because they said, we don't want this to become inaccessible, become too popular. And so Mackinac State Historic Parks, it wasn't called that exactly when it was first founded, but today it is Mackinac State Historic Parks, runs, a series of 4 sites. They run some in Mackinac City as well as Mackinac Island and administer about 80% of the island. That's who I work. So this is me over here on the dangerous end of the gun in my Royal Artillery uniform. That's my buddy Craig. That was my boss. He's the current historian, and now he's the deputy park director for them up north. A lot of some of my closest friends. I would also work on Mackinac Island as well. So we would interpret some different time periods. At Michiganders, we're obviously interpreting British soldiers, the 1770s, before that move. On the island, we interpreted the 1880s. In a lot of ways, that was really fun because the things we were doing as the soldiers, portraying soldiers of the 1880s, was exactly what soldiers in the 1880s were doing. Because it was a national park, their primary goal was showing tourists around the island. Our goal today, showing tourists around the fort and the island. So we could really empathize with a lot of those soldiers. But there were all sorts of different roles, lots of interesting skills. I'm particularly proud. This was an outfit. I hand sewed that entire outfit. It took me a whole summer. And that, believe it or not, that would actually have been very fashionable at Michiganders in the 1770s. Animal print was in. And remember, these guys were effectively in the fashion industry, in the fur trade business. So they kept up on the latest trends and trades. They were not backwoodsmen. Like Jeremiah Johnson is not living at Michiganders. These were very, wealthy businessmen who would stay up on the latest trends. But all sorts of things. We would interpret, the War of 1812. I like looking out from Fort Mackinac into this pea soup out here. And it was really great. There are other things we could do. Some days we would be interpreting voyageurs. These guys would have been a common sight around Mackinac for much of the early part of the 19th century and the 18th century. And who doesn't love a job when sometimes you don't even have to wear pants? So they would wear a breech clout and leggings, little soulier de bouffe, hop in and out of the canoes. And we actually did use the canoes. I remember this was a trip We broke in one of the new canoes that we got, and we canoed in that canoe all the way out past this point. So it's not everyone who gets to go canoeing in places like Lake Michigan. Which is pretty cool. Even getting to do things like blacksmithing. We would do lots of work around the fort. A lot of the things keeping the fort running were done in-house using period techniques. So that's me and my buddy Justin working on something. I'd be hard pressed to tell you exactly what, but it was always fun to kind of get to learn and demonstrate some of those skills. We'd also have people, reenactors, come in. So a lot of people are like, oh, you're a reenactor. And it's kind of, but also not really. You know, we're more of a tour guide, more of an interpreter is what we called the position. But we would get help from, you know, reenactment groups that would come in. It would be really fun to kind of bolster our numbers. I really like this picture because you can really tell who there is a reenactor versus who is one of the soldiers who wears this every single day. So you can see, I promise, we did laundry, but you know, you're out in all conditions, you're out in rain, wet gunpowder is the dirtiest substance known to man. And your clothes would just kind of become a little bit more dingy because you were wearing them as historic clothes. Where some people are like, oh, wow, have you ever worn this outside your house before? You know, brand new. So you could kind of tell. It was really fun. We would do lots of things like drill even after work. This was just a picture I pulled from someone took. I like this picture. Clearly, Ethan here has just gotten off of work. He's still in uniform. The rest of us either had, and so was Daniel. He's in uniform. But the rest of us all popped in. I was the drill sergeant. That is a really difficult skill to put on your resume to be like, oh, yeah, no, I'm proficient in the 1764 Manual of Exercise. I can treat you to be in the British Army in the 1770s. And then they say like, oh, that's not really useful in this office. So we lived at, this is a picture of me in some Voyageur gear there. This deeply offended my younger sister when she saw this. Andrew, you can't wear that. I'm like, hey, you know, it's historical. But this actually shows you, I didn't have too many pictures of, this is the compound where we would live. Housing was provided by the state park because it's pretty pricey to live up there if you had to find your own housing. So we lived in this 1950s motel that was just like 100 yards across the street from the museum, from the fort. It was great to be able to come and go, although you did kind of live where you work. So sometimes it has a disadvantage as well. I have a great picture here. This is truly a behind the scenes picture of us. I don't know why literally every single one of my coworkers is like working on cleaning the same musket. I took this picture. So I was clearly sitting there with the pizza at the BC Pizza was a mainstay for interpreters up there. So we loved Officer Pizzarelli and BC Pizza. You never knew what the job was going to entail. This is a great picture from the day of the battle where we were actually moving a cannon around back to Wawashkamo Golf Course. Although I do want to register a complaint with this picture because, you know, this was an interesting job. Infantry were frequently used to move cannons around and things like that. But I got to say, of all the places in the United States where you very reasonably could have said, is there not a horse that could do this? You know, we're on Mackinac Island. Why am I schlepping the cannon around? But that was us in placing artillery, one of the normal jobs you could have. This was also during the battle. I will tell you, this was really enjoyable. Some of my closest friends were in Mackinac. There were some people who'd come and I'd worked nearly the entire time with. There are some people who are still there that I'm still good friends with. People would work for maybe part of a season. They'd realize, you know, it wasn't for them. They'd want to move on. This was a guy named Austin. He was from California. He did not fit in particularly well. Kind of strange guy. We fought about a lot of different things. And so by the end of the year, when I was told, okay, during this battle, you got to pick one of your coworkers who's going to be wounded in the battle, and you're going to carry him out in front of, you know, like about 3,500 people watching this battle, and you're going to like flop him down in the middle of the golf course, and he's dead. And I said, oh, it's going to be Austin. So getting to suplex a coworker you weren't particularly fond of was a real perk of the job. So he did survive. So we made a lot of the clothes ourselves. That's a common question. Where do we get some of that stuff? Some is made. We spent a lot of time sewing inside. That was at the ladies' house. Same thing with like the gardens. We would grow a lot of our own food that we would use in the cooking demonstrations. We grew far more food than we could eat. Maintaining the buildings, as I mentioned, that was something that would just happen as part of our daily routine. So sometimes you'd be called in and be like, you're going to be painting buildings today, but interpret in a historic way. Anything they did historically, you can talk about. There are other times where we could, this was a really fun job. We launched the research vessel Arcticus. This was a brand new research vessel commission. They wanted someone to come out with a little cannon and fire. And so we brought a little 1/4 pounder swivel gun. It's a little cannon about this big. It's man portable. And that's my boss, Craig, and I. Although what was extra fun about this day is that we were in our 1812 uniforms, and Craig, although he was my boss in real life, um, I had the sergeant's uniform, and he was but a mere private. So that was very fun to get to boss him. You got to meet lots of really interesting people. This was when we celebrated 200 years of peace between the United States and Canada. I had a fun little ceremony. There's, of course, the governor. At the time, whoever the governor is, the governor's summer residence is on the island. So I've met several governors, would come into the fort. We'd see them pretty frequently. I do also love this picture because when they dismissed everyone at the end of this ceremony that they had a champagne bar. And being true 18th and 19th century soldiers, several of us made a beeline for the champagne bar. However, Kelly is the only one who didn't put it behind his back when getting a picture taken with the governor. So the rest of us were at least, stick the champagne flute out of frame. We would take care of some of the animals and livestock. We had some light livestock at Michiganders. That was a fun job. We'd play things like Bagadaway, that native game with the kids. That was always fun. And so now I never get to, anytime one of my coworkers at any job has ever complained about being too hot, I tell them, I played lacrosse in a wool uniform in the middle of the summer. I don't want to hear it. There were other times where the job would call on you to be basically like an actor. We would do court martials. This was a court martial of a guy named Augustus Shantz, or a court martial of a guy named Amos Wilkie. Augustus Shantz was a visitor to Fort Mackinac in the 1880s who was a very annoying tourist, and Amos Wilkie shoved him down on the parade ground. And so Amos Wilkie was all of our personal heroes. We all think of at least one tourist at one time we wanted to shove down. There were things like weddings. I married more people, got married more times than I care to think of. There's that nice little picture of baby sheep. I remember one skill being told to learn. We would have Fort Fright, which is kind of a Halloween themed program. And my boss told me, Andrew, you're going to be reading fortunes. You're going to be doing cartomancy. So you need to tell people's fortunes with cards. And I'm like, I'm not psychic. He's like, well, you got a couple days to learn. So see if you can figure that out. A lot of people would learn instruments up there. I play fife and taught myself fiddle up there. It was a lot of fun to learn when you got a lot of extra time on your hands. And these are just, like I said, some of my closest friends. We'd have a big party at the end of the year. This was a lot of fun where everybody would kind of get to extra dress up for people who dress up for a living. There were some days that weren't fun. This was a day lightning hit the fort. I remember that was only about 40 yards from where I was standing, and I was looking right at it. Soaked to the bone. There was splinters everywhere. It was not a fun day. It was actually on the anniversary of the attack at Michiganders. I think it was Pontiac's ghost. You are right. So I remember this day very well when that happened. There was always kind of a bit of a mainland island rivalry. This is my buddy Adam, significantly taller than me, as you can see. But even when you wear different uniforms, you can still be very good friends. That's us on board the deck of the brig Niagara that came and visited. There were things like talent shows for the workers. We would do all sorts of fun and games. I like this picture because my buddy Niall in the background here is dressed as Sergeant Paul Harm, who was just a real name that we found in the books. And we said, like, somebody named Sergeant Harm look like? Decided he had. Now, I want to kind of close things out by talking about something that comes up every year, winter at Mackinac Island. This is not the Straits of Mackinac. Every year, this gets posted. People, oh, look at all the blue ice up there. Sometimes there's blue ice, but it's not quite like this. Mackinac can be exceptionally cold. As the Straits can, of course, freeze over, depending on the year. The last couple of years have been exceptionally warm. One of the winters, you always had to find a kind of second job to do. And so one of the winters, I would usually work outreach. So I'd put on elementary school programs across the state. However, one of the winters, I wound up being a security guard for the Grand Hotel. My buddy Ted was able to get me a job there. It came with housing, which was nice, so I didn't have to be homeless over the winter. But if you've ever seen The Shining, I've lived it because I was the winter caretaker. So this is the dock in the winter. Keeps running. There's the Mighty Huron, which is not a quick and fast trip like the catamarans. This is like a 45-minute slog if you're lucky. and you can find a lot of beer cans and beer bottles. That's the first thing everybody does on board the Huron when you got this long trip to the island. And you can see it will plow through a little bit of ice, but if it freezes over, the Huron won't run anymore. They keep horses on the island year round. That's not just a gimmick. They don't just disappear in the winter. So they are still in use. And as you can see, it is particularly pretty on the island as well. However, there are snowmobiles. Islanders love snowmobiles. And here's a very seldom seen picture, not something they're ever going to put in the tourist brochures. Here's Mackinac Island's gas station. They have a gas station on the island. Ted, filling up the skeeter here. And there is how you get the gas to the gas station. So the great big tankers. So they are still pulled by horses. But as I mentioned, the beauty and the trails you can still still walk on. It's all still open in the winter. There's my beautiful picture of Arch Rock in the winter, which is a really beautiful sight to see. Here's me kind of right below that. I always include this picture. This is a goal of mine. Most of the natural rock formations, Arch Rock kind of makes sense, but a lot of the other rock formations have been named by soldiers at the fort, telling tourists year after year what they all are. You know, this is Sugarloaf or Lover's Leap or all these different names. And that's how those names came about. So we decided I wanted to name another one in the same way that the originals were named. So this is a great big rock that's right below Arch Rock. So there's M185 behind you. And we decided to call that one Kercher Loaf. So if you go there, take a picture, and you say, like, oh, here's me standing on Kercher Loaf. And my goal is someday to get that onto the official maps. So this is what it looked like after a commute to work. This was a bitterly cold winter in 2014 when I was up there. We had, I think, 30 consecutive days where it did not get to zero. So it was very, very cold. The Grand is a beautiful place in the summer. It is very pretty in the winter as well, but there's no one there. It's closed. They close in October. It's not heated inside. They have a dry pipe system, so it is bitterly cold. And this is what it would actually look like most days. This is when they do a lot of construction projects. So they might heat one small portion of the hotel, like a room or two, where they're doing some renovation. And this is actually what it looked like most days when I arrived at the hotel. Since I was the new guard, I got the midnight shift, so 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. You know, we think about all these bright coverings on the inside. A lot of that furniture goes away. Most of it gets covered. It's dark. You wear one of these. This is called a Detex clock, great big clock, and you put keys into it and twist the key to show where you were in the hotel at a certain time. Every hour, you make a whole loop of rounds, and there's something like 37 or 38 keys that you meet at. You walk about a mile and a half. Again, there's another great picture of this. Is like that whole winter. It was just incredibly snowy and blurry. I took this picture. Does anybody see the fun thing that's in this picture? Yeah, there's the stadium. So there are a couple of cars on the island. The state troopers have a car. They don't like to use it a lot in the summer, but in the winter, they use it a lot. So I snapped a picture of it. The state park also has a pickup truck that they very seldomly use. I remember one day one of our rangers, Justin, had the pickup truck out. He hopped into Mission House and he left the truck out in the front yard. And I ran over and hopped in the front seat. And like, just put it in gear and move forward 10 feet. And came out and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I just want to be able to tell people I've driven a car." So I have driven a car on Mackinac Island. Room 237, if you are a fan of The Shining. And this is Harrisonville. This is the part of the island that not a lot of people go to, but this is where most of the island residents actually live. And this is where my room was. I was right down here in the furthest corner of Harrisonville, because this also belongs to the Grand Hotel. This is where the workers live. So they had me stay up here so I could keep an eye on things. And I had a tiny little heated room. There's what my little room is. There are a lot of things that you can do on Mackinac Island in the winter. They have a tree. There are about 500 people who live there. There's a picture of the school, lots of snowmobiles. Lots of kids will bike year round, depending on the weather. There are things like the public library that stays open. I love libraries for lots of reasons, but they kept me going that winter. This looks like a house, but this is actually called Harrisonville General. It's a little general store. If you've ever wanted to pay $4.50 for a candy bar, you can do it at Harrisonville General. The post office, stays open. There's your lifeline to the outside world because, once the ferries stop running, airport's only way in or out. It's a $50 ticket to go to St. Ignace on like a 2-minute flight. You kind of go up and down because it's only 3 miles, very short. But they are able to deliver lots of things to the island, so that you can get your UPS package delivered. So in some ways, it's not as different as the rest of the world, and in a lot of ways, it's completely different. Mackinac Island is a really amazing place, both historically and to live today. So if you ever get the chance, I know a lot of retirees take a job up there for even the summer. I highly endorse it, recommend it. It is a great place, a lot of fun. Now, I know I've talked a little bit over my hour length, so I apologize for that, but you can tell it's something that I'm particularly passionate about. I hope that you guys enjoyed hearing about Mackinac. I hope that you learned at least one new thing about the island, or if you haven't been, maybe that inspired you. Go check out the island and the whole Straits, anywhere up in Mackinac. I love St. Ignace. I love Mackinac City. Wilderness State Park is one of my favorite places. The whole area is really cool. And again, my name is Andrew Kercher. So if you do have any questions, that's my email address right there. That's my website, kercher.info. I do a whole series of lectures and visit museums or libraries and museums, historical societies, you name it. You give me 3 people to talk in front of, I'll do it. But these are all different talks that I do. So if any of those look, particularly interesting to you, or you want to check out my website, there's more there. I'm sure you can request that at your local library. And I would love to be able to come back. And if you didn't enjoy it, well, it doesn't cost anything to just leave. So, but again, thank you so much. I'd love to take any questions that you guys have. Sure. It's the Legend of the Loon, the Legend of Sleeping Bear Dunes. I will tell you in 1 second. I do not remember the guy's name. The book is by Kathy Jo Wargan, and the illustrator is Gisbert van Frankenhuizen. Wargin, Oregon. The Legend of Mackinac. Bagataway. Like it sounds. They didn't have an English spelling, so like spellings vary all the time. Bagataway. So like Baggitay. That's just as valid as anything else. I've always wanted to host, as a historian who reads a lot of old documents, I've always wanted to host an 18th century spelling bee, because you give them a word, they give a spelling, and then you say, sure, seems fine to me, no matter what they spell it. That was not standardized. So I have been on Off the Radar. Yeah, I'm excited that we're actually filming another one in Port Huron in May. So I have been on Under the Radar. Yep. Yeah, I love Tom Dalton. He's a great guy. I did, yes. Oh, well, thank you. I talk a lot about maritime things as well. I married a lighthouse keeper. So my wife is the lighthouse keeper at the Fort Gratiot Light. So I've got a few talks kind of related to that. Yeah. There are a couple of cemeteries. This is a great question. They have quite a few restrictions in some of the cemeteries because space is so limited. So you have to be an island resident for a certain amount of time. St. Anne's Cemetery, kind of the main one. That is the Catholic cemetery, basically adjacent to a larger, I guess, what would you call it, municipal cemetery. But there are burials there. Not to mention the island itself is really an incredibly ancient cemetery. Indigenous people typically bury by the water. So if you go digging anywhere on the island or anywhere really in the state, don't be surprised at all. One of the most famous stories, and I'll try and make this very brief. After the battle, or after the attack at Michiganders, there is a British fur trader by the name of Alexander Henry. And Alexander Henry is able to survive the attack. He has a friend with a local chief who basically like skirts him away, because as gruesome as it is, several of the British soldiers who were captured and British fur traders, many of them were tortured to death, executed. Several of them were ritualistically eaten. Cannibalism was pretty common in the 18th century at that time. And so his friend's like, we got to get you out of here, man, because this is a pretty bad fate. So he scoops him up. He takes him over to Mackinac Island. And Alexander Henry, in his written account, which if you want to read this, you can read the Diary of Alexander Henry. It's great reading. You can find it online. I'm sure there's been several versions of it published. He says, all right, so I got over to Mackinac Island. I was fearful for my life, but he said that they stuck him in this cave. They said, sleep in here. Nobody's going to find you. And I'll come back for you in a day or two. Just deal with it. You won't die. So Alexander Henry tries to go to bed, and he says he's got can't sleep. So there are all these like bones, or there are all these like sticks and stones, and then finds out they're bones that are poking into him when he wakes up the next morning. He's like, oh, wait, these are all bones. I am sleeping in like an open air cemetery, like a catacomb. And that's Skull Cave today. And that's how it got its name, because that was a very common burial place on the island, full of thousands of years. And what Wadham knew when he stuck Alexander Henry there was this very sacred place. There was kind of a taboo. He said a lot of the natives are not going to come over here to find you if we stick you in here, because nobody wants to visit this area. So that's a cemetery. So in some ways, the entire island is a cemetery. You can find out a lot about the island. One of the things that a lot of people talk about these cemeteries are some of the carriage tours. If any of you ever went on one of those, I will tell you to take literally everything the carriage tour drivers say with like a huge handful of salt, because they will always favor, a good joke. I didn't even subject you to telling you like, yeah, the cemeteries are so popular, people are dying to get in. That's just what they love to do on the carriage tours. So there's some misinformation, but there's even a military cemetery as well. That's something that the soldiers at the fort every year, on Memorial Day, they will go out and have a service there, of just from some of the soldiers who died at the fort of either accidents or disease, old age, anything like that. So yeah, several cemeteries. It's kind of subjective. It's about some of the presidents that you might not like. How much do you know about Grover Cleveland or Millard Fillmore? They're, people are really famous, but if they're not on money or aren't super famous, so I talk about, I don't know, about 15, 20 of the presidents that are kind of lesser known today. So, yes. There's a couple out there that are pretty ripe. There's a few like murder and mayhem type tours that you can go on, and there's a couple. I think I know the one you're talking about, but I don't know if I can recall all of the details. She was visiting a hotel, and they found her like out back behind the kitchen, and they never quite solved what happened. Crime is really not too common on the island. I will tell you this: you guys want the inside scoop? Crime is not very common on the island. A lot of people die on the island, not from crime, but from things like accidents. People who hop on a bike. Well, people hop on a bike. Some retiree goes up there, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I'm retired. I can do whatever I want now, and I know how to ride a bike. I rode one when I was in fifth grade." And it's like, "Sir, you are 75. Maybe don't try and go around the whole island." And they'll get to the back and just big heart attack and die. And so. And horses are not particularly safe. People go there and like, well, there's no cars. I don't have to look both ways when I step out in the street. Or people like, oh, a horsey, I want to pet it. It's like, do that. Horses are living. They're dangerous. They're big. They're pretty scary. So you have to be very cautious. So there is some death, but not a lot of it is murder, if that makes sense. So. No, that was actually a picture from an airplane. It's from the plane from St. Ignace. That was right by the airport. Fort Holmes. So that's where the reconstruction is. Fort Holmes. There is a blockhouse right. But again, I don't want to take any more of your time. I will stick around if anybody else does have any other questions or wants to talk shop. But again, thank you so much for letting me come in and share. I really appreciate it.